So if you remember my slide on fishing in the preprint stream, Katherine is going to talk to you about how Company of Biologists is doing that.
Okay, and this just...
You just click forward and back.
Awesome. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to talk a bit about preprints in the journal ecosystem. So I'm sure everybody knows what a preprint is, but I'm just going to make sure we're all on the page of what is a preprint and why are we all talking about them so much at the moment. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the strategy and policy decisions that we've been talking a lot about at the Company of Biologists. I should say I'm the executive editor of Development, one of the Company of Biologists journals, and I've been quite involved in a lot of these discussions. I'll then talk about our sort of changing relationship with preprint servers and how we've sort of undergone a 180 on what we think about preprints over the last 5 years. And then finally, I'll just talk a little bit about a new service that we've just launched called preLights, and also about some of the other preprint discussion sites that are coming up at the moment. So what is a preprint? So this is just giving you the Wikipedia definition of a preprint, which is a version of a paper that precedes publication in a peer-reviewed journal. So typically these are initial versions of manuscripts, although we are seeing authors putting up quite late versions of papers on there as well. Typically it's unformatted or it's in a PDF version deposited onto a preprint server. So there's a long history of preprints running all the way back to sort of paper versions back in the 60s, but I think it really sort of kicked off in the early 90s with the launch of arXiv for the physics community, and that was really as a way of getting papers online before a lot of journals actually had decent online websites. NPG launched Nature Proceedings in 2007, and that was sort of, I gathered from Claire yesterday that actually BMJ had a very early version of a preprint server earlier than that, but that was one of the sort of the first times I started to hear about preprints. It launched in 2007, but it really didn't take off, and it folded 5 years later. And then when sort of everybody, I think, really started talking about preprints in the biological sciences, which is sort of where we've come in, was with the launch of bioRxiv from the Cold Spring Harbor laboratories in 2013. And now, sort of 5 years on or 4 years on, we've really got a plethora of preprint servers serving various different communities, and you'll hear about medRxiv, which is launching soon from Claire next. At least in the biological sciences, and this differs from field to field, in physics this is not necessarily the case, but in the biological sciences, authors tend to submit their preprint to a preprint server at the same time that they submit to a journal. And I think that's quite important in terms of thinking about how we can actually potentially take advantage of preprints or how we work with them. They're not putting them up at an earlier stage than that, at least not the majority of people. So this just shows you the growth of preprints in the biological sciences, and I think it's really dramatic. So in red at the bottom, you've got arXiv, which has got a quantitative biology section, and that's just sort of been sort of pottering along for the past 10 years, growing relatively slowly. The little bar in brown that you can hardly see was the biology section of Nature Proceedings, which you can see sort of hardly took off at all. And then the giant green growth is bioRxiv, and you can see that really over the last 4 or 5 years that's just taken off massively, and the number of preprints that they're publishing per month is still growing and still increasing, and it's really been, I think, really adopted by large sections of the biology community at this point. I'm not going to go through the benefits of preprinting too much. I think that the one thing I'd mainly say is that it really gets your research results out there early. We all know that publication can take up to a year or more, and authors want to get their work out early and readers want to read their work early, and that's really where we see where the community sees the benefits of preprinting. The other thing I'd just highlight is there's a lot of talk around preprints and scooping in the biological sciences, and there's a lot of fear, so the authors would feel like they'd been scooped if they put their stuff up on a preprint server, that somebody would then rush to formal publication, and then they would be seen to having been scooped by the person who's published the paper. I think that this is changing. I think that now more and more the preprint is being seen as establishing priority, and so that concern is beginning to go away. One of the things that I think does remain around concerns is that a preprint has not been peer-reviewed, and while peer review isn't perfect, there's some degree of validation there, and a significant degree of validation there. And I think that there is a bit of a worry about that, and I know Claire's going to talk about that more in the context of medRxiv. From a publisher's perspective, what do publishers think about preprints? So this is sort of, I think, the concerns that we've certainly had as a, partially at least a subscription publisher. There's a version of the paper, it may not be the final version of the paper, but there's a version of the paper that's available for free elsewhere. And so you might get decreased website usage because people will be going to the bioRxiv version rather than to the publisher version. We know that in some cases the community continues to cite the preprint rather than cite the final published version of the paper, although certainly bioRxiv discourages that. And so possible decreased citations, although again I know that bioRxiv are looking at ways of being able to merge citations. And so both of these things I think do have the potential to undermine the business model of particularly of subscription publishers, but potentially all publishers. And then in a bigger picture way, I think there is the potential to disrupt current models of peer review. If a paper's out there early, people can look at it, people can comment on it, and as I'll talk in a minute, people can actually do peer review on it. Why do we need to go to journals at all? I think we're a long way away from preprints sort of overtaking or really being competition for journals, but there are people out there who are pushing quite hard in that direction, and I think it is something that we all need to be thinking about. So these are some of the things that I say that we've been thinking about over the past 4 or 5 years, and that I'm sure most of you or some of you in the room will already be thinking about where you need to, but yeah. So the first and most obvious one is, should the journal I'm sorry, I didn't update this. The question should be here, should the authors allow posting of preprints? So, 5 years ago, back in 2013, Company of Biologists did not allow posting of preprints. We specifically said that if you put your paper on a preprint server, we wouldn't consider it for publication in the journal. There is a really clear trend towards openness to preprints, and I think that publishers that don't allow posting are seeing quite a backlash from the community. There's now a Wikipedia page which lists basically all publishers and journals and states their attitude towards preprinting. And you don't really want to be one of the red ones. You can't see the details here, but in red is basically where a journal will not allow preprinting. And I think that publishers probably don't really want to be on that red list. And certainly Cell Press, who were quite negative towards preprinting at the beginning, got a lot of negative backlash as a result of that. So then, the second question then is should you then allow posting of an updated version of a manuscript? So, as I said at the moment, what happens most of the time is people will put their preprint onto bioRxiv or wherever at the time they initially submit to a journal. bioRxiv allows you to update versions and to put revised versions on there. But obviously, revised versions are more similar to published versions and therefore pose a greater business threat because you have free access to a sort of more final copy elsewhere. The Company of Biologists, we've essentially decided that once we've invested in the paper by sending it out for peer review and providing feedback to authors, we would prefer authors not to post a revised version of the manuscript. But different publishers have taken different decisions on that. Then the next sort of question I think we all need to be thinking about is around licensing. bioRxiv offers a whole range of licenses all the way through from author retains copyright through to a full CC BY version. And obviously different journals have different licenses as well, and should you essentially place some restrictions on what kind of license the author is allowed to post the preprint on, or alternatively, once they've posted the preprint, what kind of license they should be publishing with you under. Some journals will enforce or try to enforce open access publication where the authors have chosen an open access license for the preprint. I think that's quite hard to police and quite hard to enforce, particularly if you bear in mind that papers may well have been submitted elsewhere before they come to you. But I think that, again, that web page that I showed, that Wikipedia table I showed you earlier, is also listing journal policies on licensing, and I think it's something that journals probably need to be making policies on if they haven't already, or publishers. And then something that we've started to try to get people talking about is whether the publisher should be allowing authors to discuss the preprint through online discussion channels prior to publication. So some journals will consider that this breaks embargo policies and media discussion policies, and we've run up against this a little bit with preLights, and authors are certainly concerned about whether they start discussing their paper on a preprint discussion site might compromise potential publication in the journal. To be totally honest, this isn't something that we really thought about very much before we launched our preprint discussion site, because we see people discussing preprints all the time on Twitter and on social media and all over the place, and we didn't really see this as an issue. But we have come up against a couple of journals that have said, no, the authors are not allowed to discuss this because that would break our media policies. Very few journals have formal policies on this. We've only just formulated our own, but I think it is something that we're all going to start coming up against. And obviously we'd like to allow authors to discuss things as freely as they want to. And then I think finally, coming back to scooping, which is something that all authors are very concerned about. Lots of journals have scoop protection policies these days, so at Company of Biologists we tell authors that as long as they've submitted their paper to us before a competing paper comes out, we won't reject that paper because it's been scooped. Some journals like Embo have now extended their scoop protection policy to the date at which the preprint has been posted on the server, and I think that we're starting to think about doing that as well. The one concern we have around that is whether it's going to start encouraging authors to submit preprints very prematurely at an early date to try and gain protection at that very early date, and so that's something we're all looking at as well. I'm sure most people are already thinking about all of these things, but I'd say that if you're not thinking about these issues, then I think we do all need to be getting in this, because certainly in the biological sciences, preprints are only growing, are only going to gain traction, and we all need to have policies around them that hopefully are going to facilitate the early sharing of research results without undermining more traditional models of publishing. The other thing that publishers are now, particularly with bioRxiv, have the opportunity to do is to actually integrate with preprint servers. So there are increasing numbers of journals integrating with bioRxiv to facilitate co-submission to the journal and to bioRxiv, so that authors don't have to go through the hassle of submitting both to the bioRxiv server and to the journal site. And so bioRxiv has two flavors of this. They have the B2J option, whereby you submit to bioRxiv, and through that you can then transfer to the journal, and they've got over 100 journals that are integrated with that. That's not quite so straightforward, because in general journals require more than bioRxiv does, so often you still have to put in a load of information once you do that transfer. The J2B option, whereby you submit to the journal and post automatically to bioRxiv, is less hassle for the authors, but there are also fewer journals that are offering that, and I think at least in part that's because of submission system integration. And so because we've been with BenchPress and so a bioRxiv, that's made that quite easy for us, and so we adopted that quite early on. But I think more journals, and certainly PLOS, have just announced that they're doing a version of that as well. This is what it looks like within BenchPress. It's a whole load of questions. We've possibly over-engineered this. And the reason we've over-engineered this is because we discovered that quite a lot of authors were ticking the yes, I'd like to deposit to bioRxiv by mistake, and then complaining to us when they discovered that their paper was on bioRxiv, even though there's a big red button saying this is what you're doing. And so we've basically put in about 3 different places where they have to say, yes, I really want to do this. We're not seeing that as a problem anymore, but in the early days we did have quite a lot of cases of this, particularly I'd say from Asia. But now essentially once authors hit the final yes, they don't have to do anything more when the paper comes out on bioRxiv at the same time it's submitted to one of our journals. John's already talked about this, but I think preprints do provide an opportunity for publishers, with the caveat that by the time you see the preprint, it's almost certainly under consideration elsewhere. But lots of journals are now thinking about mining the preprint literature for possible submissions. So some journals, so PLOS Genetics was one of the first ones to do this, to actually have a dedicated team of preprint editors scanning the preprint literature and then writing to authors inviting submission. Various other journals are doing that on a slightly less formal basis, so this is just MBOC who do it quite a bit. And on the converse, occasionally we are seeing authors who are submitting to preprint servers before submitting to a journal, and then going onto social media and actually saying, who wants this paper? I haven't seen very much of that, but that's one example that actually came our way. And so I think it does provide a potential opportunity. And I think if you target the email right, I've done it a few times, authors do like it. So, Company of Biologists and Preprint. Again, this is just showing the bioRxiv deposits since it launched in November 2013. And then overlaid on that is our basically changing attitude. So when this starts, we didn't allow preprints. Pretty quickly after that, the board decided that each journal should be able to decide its own policies according to its community needs. And you can basically see that over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, pretty much regularly we've made policy changes, different journals moving at different speeds to first allow preprints, then integrate with bioRxiv, and then finally to develop this preprint highlighting service. Just looking at the actual numbers, so I took the data from development and looked at bioRxiv over the last year, basically published or posted about 290 papers under the category developmental biology, and about a quarter of those have been through our system, so either through the J2B or the B2J portal. And so we're seeing quite a high proportion of the papers. Now, whether that's because that would come there anyway, or whether that's because of our policies, is hard to know, but I think it's quite a good stat to show that we're really capturing a good share of that market. We then, in 2016, so the Company of Biologists runs a blog called The Node, and we started highlighting all of the preprints across the developmental biology field and related fields across all of the preprint servers. And it's growing as a list, so basically it's a list, a curated list of preprints that our community might be interested in. And this is the most popular thing we have ever done on the Node. People loved it. And that really got us starting to think about what more should we and could we be doing as a community not-for-profit publisher to support the preprint literature. And that led to the launch of preLights. And so basically the idea was that as the number of preprint grows, it becomes increasingly difficult to navigate the literature to decide what to read. That although bioRxiv does have a commenting function, nobody really uses it, and discussion on preprints hasn't really taken off. And so we thought that it would be a good thing for us to do something in the preprint area to facilitate curation and commenting on preprints, with the sort of side benefit that it alerts authors to the fact that we're preprint friendly and that therefore we're someone to think about for submitting papers. And so this is preLights. This launched in February. It was a pretty quick launch. We only decided finally to do it in October. And essentially what it is it's highlighting of preprints by a community of postdocs, mainly with some students and PIs. So basically what we did was we went out to our community and we identified a group of about 80 early career researchers who were active in the kind of preprint area and who we thought would make an interesting group of people to comment on preprints. Part of what this is also all about is really trying to build a community of people to help promote them, to help support them. We've got a Slack group where they all go online and discuss, and they're really building a network, and so that's sort of a side benefit of this for us as well. And then what they do is they choose their favorite or most thought-provoking preprint, and they write a comment, they write a short highlight of it and say why they're excited about it and what they think it does for the field. And then importantly, we've asked them as well to reach out to the authors and to try and get the authors involved in a discussion about the preprint. And so in a reasonable number of cases, we're also getting author responses where the prelighter will ask some questions and the author will then say, here's my answer to these questions, here's the backstory behind this paper, and here's some more interesting information. This also shows a case where we've also got comments on it. Again, we're finding commenting is not really taking off, and that's something that we're trying to decide whether to push or to accept. That, as we all know, commenting on papers is not something that's working very well. So 4 months in, or 5 months in, wherever we are, as I say, we initially recruited about 85 prelighters from across the scope of our journals. We went live in mid-February. We've now had over 100 posts. We get a few hundred views a day, reasonable number of followers on Twitter. We're pretty pleased with these stats. It's really early days, but in terms of engagement, we're quite pleased with how things are going. We're now really ramping up, so we had a full-time community manager join at the beginning of May, and that actually provides us with the internal resources to be able to do more. And we're currently trying to expand the team. So we launched pretty heavily in the cell and developmental biology fields, and we'd like to broaden that out to a much broader section of biology, particularly in areas where preprinting is very strong, like genomics, microbiology, and things like that. And so we're trying to expand the team at the moment while still wanting to keep it relatively manageable as a size. And the feedback from the community has just been hugely positive. Everybody seems to really like this as an initiative. We're not the only ones who've done this. So there are, over the past 6 months or so, at least 5 other sites that are doing varying things from journal clubs through to full-on peer review and overlay journals. And it'll be interesting to see how all these things develop. bioRxiv actually links out to those preprint discussion sites as well, so that you can see where the discussion is happening on sites outside of bioRxiv. And finally, I think, what have we got out of it as a company? It's really early days to say it. Basically, we've got positive reaction. Everybody likes us, which is great. I think it's also changed the perception of us as a publisher to quite a large extent. We've been seen always as quite a traditional publisher, but this has, I think, changed our perception to being seen as much more forward-looking in terms of where we're going. Whether it will translate into quality submissions, I think, is a key question, from a business perspective, but it's really too early to tell. And I'm done. Thank you.
Wow, thanks. It'll be really interesting to see whether this kind of activity gets the early career research community engaged in your publications.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing for us is, will the
know.
submit?
Let us know what the data shows. Questions? So we have, let's see, we'll start from the back coming forward.
Roger Jones. I'm the editor of the British Journal of General Practice, which is a primary healthcare journal. Really very, very interesting and raises all sorts of questions. And I want to come to quality right at the end, but it's like Wagner.
Go ahead, we're okay.
Clearly, some of these preprints will get into the preprint system with a pedigree. They'll have been published, presented at conferences, conference abstracts, institutional seminars, and probably that's maybe an indication of quality. How do you moderate this to prevent people with, I'll get into print anyhow, and just sending in a preprint with no background? And going to your very last comment, do you have any idea of how many preprints get translated into peer-reviewed, accepted papers?
As I understand it, bioRxiv had an initial screening system, and I think this maybe partly will also help bioRxiv succeed over Nature Proceedings, which, as I understand it, did get quite clogged with rubbish. bioRxiv have an initial screen where basically they just say, is it science and does it look like a research paper? And so they have a sort of they have a bunch of people to whom all preprints pass through somebody's hands to look at it. We were really concerned. One of the things that we in general were quite concerned about preprints was, what's the quality going to be like, and is it going to be clogged with rubbish? And I think in general on bioRxiv at least, you don't really see that. I think that certainly when I talk to people, they're quite concerned about putting stuff out on bioRxiv, because if it proves to be wrong because it's not been peer reviewed, then there's a big reputational damage to them. And so what we're seeing at the moment at least is that bioRxiv is not being filled up with pseudoscience or very, very preliminary versions of papers. Whether that changes in the long run, I don't know. In terms of the numbers on what gets translated through to publication, I don't remember the stats. bioRxiv do create those stats. Bernd knows. Yeah. So I don't know if you didn't hear that. It's about 60% through to publishers through to published within 2 years. So it's a reasonable proportion.
Bernd, did you have another comment, and then we'll come up to Ellen?
Great talk. Just a couple of points on the preprints that we think are open for discussion and that we have to come to a consensus on. So one thing you already mentioned is embargoes. I think journals really have to move beyond the classical press embargo, which is of course there to ensure the press covers reliable information. I think that ship is almost sailed, and we have to really adapt to this, and it would be great to have a sort of consensual policy on that, because it's really damaging at the moment to block preprints in this way. And the second thing is that preprints, there's a real drift in the system that we're noticing that preprints are accepting more and more of the secondary literature, so reviews and commentary and so on. And of course that becomes a big problem for journals, because journals are still in business in physics because they're still used for research assessment, basically. Preprints are not used, and journals are. That's what's keeping us in business. For the front end of journals, that's not relevant. So once you have it on a preprint, there's really no more reason to have it in a journal, I think. So that's a key point.
Yeah.
And just a final comment on your preLights, I think it's great you're doing that. As preprints become more important, I guess there's also a responsibility then to try to cover things in a balanced way, because these things will start to matter, which things are highlighted by your service, because that's what funders will start to look at and so on in the next few years. And if you highlight something, or badge it even at some point, this will start to matter. So we have to find a way to make this scalable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's important. We're trying to, so that's one of the reasons as well why we talked a lot at the beginning about, is this a small group of people, or is it open to anyone to post, their comments on it? And one of the things that concerned us was that if we opened it up quite broadly, people would just come along and write a highlight about their friend's preprint, and then it wouldn't become something. And so we've tried quite hard to find people that we think, it's hard to know, but we're trying to find people who are going to write responsibly. And actually we've discovered on our Slack channels that they're actually talking really intelligently about, I want to highlight this preprint, but I know this person quite well. Is that a conflict of interest? Am I allowed to do that? And so, at least for the group we've got at the moment, they are thinking about that in quite careful ways, I think. And so that's why we'd like to keep it as a managed group, so that we've got some kind of, we can help support them in that. But we do want it to be a community-led initiative rather than a publisher-led initiative as well. So,
Ella?
Are you planning to monetize this in any way? Obviously, you said that you invested in a full-time member of staff, or do you just see it as an investment in the quality of the manuscripts that come through to you as part of?
I think probably neither of those things, actually. We see it as something that's good for the community. We're a not-for-profit. Part of our mission is to do things to support the community, and so we're in quite a nice position where we don't need to monetize it. So no, we've got no intention to do that.
Are there other questions?
Not.
Yeah, there's a speaker behind you.
Not so much a question, just a comment. At the moment, we are working with bioRxiv to pull data into ImpactVisor to try to add some analytics to a lot of the assumptions I think we make about the place of preprints in the larger ecosystem. One of the things I'm particularly interested in looking at is, do J to B deposits to bioRxiv typically perform better when they do become published in a peer-reviewed journal? The other assumption I think it's important for us to check is that preprints are being used as kind of a dress rehearsal for publication in a peer-reviewed journal. I think that's the assumption we're all making. Let's check that to make absolutely sure that's the case. Do preprint deposits that get comments typically perform better or are more successful getting published in peer-reviewed journals? Those sorts of things we're going to be looking at, and hopefully we'll have some white papers shortly after. I'm hoping to work with Cold Spring Harbor on some white papers to try to understand better the position of preprints in the continuum.
Yeah, so I think the only thing I've got to say on that is that our experience has been very different on different journals. So we found for development that J2B papers at least have a slightly better chance of getting accepted than the average paper, whereas B2J papers have a lower chance. But this has been quite journal dependent and the numbers are still small, but it's something we're actively tracking as well, given that we've got it across all our journals in both directions. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Just a couple of other quick points. Anecdotally, it looks like preprints do get more early citations or get citations earlier than traditionally published papers, but we're trying to pull enough data in that we could say yes, that's a conclusion. And so the question is, if you draw more citations into the ISI citation window, that could be an advantage, but the data has not been analyzed yet on that. Second, I remember hearing from Cold Spring Harbor that they have reports from preprint authors that they get a lot of feedback from the community, but it's private. And some pretty significant number, 30, 40 or so % of them actually get some kind of email.
I think it very much varies on who you talk to as to what those numbers are.
It could be, this is anecdata again. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so my name's Claire Rawlinson. I work at the BMJ, and I'm going to talk to you about medRxiv, which is a publisher-neutral preprint server for the health sciences. So Katherine's just done a great job of explaining what preprints are, but essentially these are draft manuscripts. They've not been peer-reviewed. So medRxiv is founded by Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories, which is a not-for-profit research and educational institution that runs bioRxiv, which is probably the life sciences' most successful preprint server. We've been working with the Yale Open Data Access Project, or YODA, and Theo Bloom and I from the BMJ, we've been working since September last year to work out how we can make preprints work in clinical medicine. Now, you may have heard of medRxiv, but you may not have heard of BMJ's involvement, and this is kind of breaking news. We actually just signed an agreement yesterday for BMJ to publicly be involved in this. So because we've not made any announcements, I'm happy to talk to you about this, but prefer it if you didn't tweet about this until we make our own announcement. Okay, so why is BMJ concerned with preprints? Well, there's two main reasons. So the first reason is one of mission. So BMJ's vision is to create a healthier world, and everything that we do as a company comes back to that vision. And we believe that preprints have the potential to, in some part, help us realise that vision through the acceleration of scientific communication and discovery. So how can preprints accelerate scientific discovery? Well, we believe that one of the best ways to accelerate science is through the acceleration of the communication and the dissemination of results. So we've talked about the average communication lag being somewhere between 9 and 24 months, depending on the area. And Dr. Steve Quake, who works for the Chan Zuckerberg BioHub, he last year presented some modelling around what would happen if you remove that lag that we see between research and publication. And he found, his model says that if you remove this lag, then in 10 years we could see a 5-fold acceleration in scientific discovery. So if you click that link, you can see his presentation. It's really good. And with the success of bioRxiv, we're actually starting to see case studies of this happening. So on this slide is a timeline of some tweets and a discussion about a collaboration and research that actually started almost 7 months before the paper was formally published in a journal, and this was solely because the researcher saw preprint. However, as part of BMJ's vision for a healthier world, we also believe that there is a potential risk with posting clinical preprints. They could be used to spread misinformation. They could be misinterpreted. The data could be wrong, it could be falsified, or it could come to the wrong assumptions. And any of these issues could be harmful to health, which would be completely against our vision, and that's something that we don't want to do. So BMJ was really keen to be at the table of helping to define the processes and policies that could help to kind of minimise the risk to health from the posting of preprints. So for BMJ, this is a matter of vision. It's a project about our values, not a business per se. So the second reason that BMJ wanted to be involved is that we've done this before. And 20 years ago, when Archive was launching and the internet had revolutionized how draft manuscripts were shared between authors, the then deputy editor of the BMJ, Tony Delamoth, he started a discourse in the journal about what the BMJ should do about preprints. And he conducted a large survey of the readership who were positive, with the caveat that preprints should be clearly labelled as not being peer-reviewed. And so in 1999, we launched ClinMed NetPrints, the world's first preprint server, and this was hosted by HighWire, so John will remember this very well. They're pretty awesome, weren't they? But we closed this server down in 2005 because after 6 years of being live, we only received about 80 submissions. So last year, with 27 being the year of the preprint, we started thinking, actually, is there a place for preprints in clinical medicine? Did they not work? Did this show us they didn't work? Or actually, was this the right product at the wrong time? And then just to show you how we mitigated the risk back in the 90s, we had this big warning that you had to click that you accepted that the articles that you were about to read hadn't been peer reviewed before you could even get to the site. You then had to click it a further time before you could read any of the articles that were on there. Okay, so those are the two reasons why BMJ felt strongly about being involved in preprints. And now I want to talk a bit about what we're actually doing with medRxiv. So the main way that we can minimise the risk of what is posted is to have a good screening process, a good pre-screening procedure. So it needs to be fast because this is not about performing peer review. This is not determining quality or accuracy. bioRxiv has an average speed of 24 hours between posting. We anticipate that being a bit longer for medRxiv because of the extra considerations that we need to look at. So we're solely trying to minimise the risk. And in this slide are some of the examples of the things that we're considering. And I should say that the basis of this, is based on the bioRxiv screening. We're really lucky they've put a lot of thought into this, but we've added an extra layer on top for medical considerations. So under the heading of ethical considerations, the first thing that we're going to check for is, is this a paper? Is this science? Is it an obvious advertisement? We'll also look for legal considerations. We're going to run all the submissions through Authenticate to check for plagiarism. We'll check for obvious defamation. However, we'll put the onus on the author to actually assert a lot of this stuff. It's not things that we're actually going to be cross-referencing. We're going to aim not to post anything that could identify a patient, so we won't post patient photographs, and we've decided not to accept case reports as an article type because we feel there's too big a risk in this. And the pharma case is also quite interesting. People say to us, well, how are you going to ensure that this isn't a marketing tool for pharma? But pharma aren't actually allowed to advertise their products except for approved uses, except if they're working under the peer review exemption. And because preprints aren't peer reviewed, would this be considered inappropriate promotion anyway? But really the most important part of our screening check is to see if a preprint is posted, will it do harm? Or does it have the potential to change behaviour that would cause harm? And so, because of this, we're going to pay a lot of attention, and we're going to escalate articles that fall under these types of research. So we're going to pay close attention to dual-use research, so anything that is noble on one hand, but on the other hand it could be used to cause harm. So for example, kind of potential biohazards such as anthrax. We'll pay close attention to vaccine safety, anything to do with the transmission of infectious disease, and also anything that either promotes or disputes drug regimens, or anything that looks at the toxicity or carcinogenicity of common substances. So those are the general considerations. I'm just going to talk through the kind of workflow, which we're still kind of getting to grips with. We've not completely defined yet. So all along we'll be considering the questions on the right-hand side. Is it nonsense? Is it non-science? Is it a health threat? So the first step is going to be an automated check, which will be run by bench press, and this just checks that all the required information has been input. So we're checking that the author has asserted, have you ticked this box? So we're going to be looking at things like, have all authors given consent, and we'll ask for their information about funding, have they stated competing interests, if there's a trial, has it been registered, is there data sharing, have relevant reporting checklists been filled in, has it been to IRB review, and is there patient consent if necessary? In the second step, staff at Cold Spring Harbour are going to check for things such as obscenity, obvious defamation, pseudoscience, commercial advertisements, and also they'll be looking for images of human subjects, and also any other kind of like high-level identifiers of populations, for example, geographic location, or any of these things that might identify a patient. And then as a third step, all submissions will be sent to a medRxiv affiliate who is a subject area expert and kind of a bit like an editorial board member on a journal. And what we're going to be asking them to do is to screen for the do no harm considerations. So they're going to be asked to flag any paper that if the conclusions or recommendations in the paper are later found to be wrong, is there a potential risk to the health of the public from its early dissemination? And then the next step will be that the submissions will be sent for further review by a panel of experienced senior editors and clinicians. We've got that as escalation 1 now. To start with, we think everything will go to this step. It may move to an escalation level later. As I say, we're still kind of defining this. But all final decisions on whether to decline or post will reside with the medRxiv Management Committee. And it's important to note that as we start this project, we're going to have a very, very low threshold for flagging papers and escalating for further look for harm. So just to give you a couple of examples of the type of manuscripts that we would and we wouldn't post, I'm going to give you a couple of live examples from bioRxiv. Which demonstrates some of these policies. So in this example, a manuscript that was submitted that stated that the evidence said that HIV was not sexually transmitted. So what would happen if people acted on this information and it was wrong? Well, the disease could be spread and this would be a clear public health risk, and so this was rejected. Conversely, in this case, this manuscript was research about cell phones causing brain tumours in rats. So it was questioned what would happen if people acted on this information. And it was deemed that people might use their cell phones or mobile phones a bit less. And so this was not considered to be an issue of public health harm, and so it was posted. So I'm just going to show you a couple of beta images of medRxiv, and if it looks familiar, it's because it's a clone of the bioRxiv site. It's exactly the same, but you can see on the front page here we have some very clear labelling that a caution that what you're about to see hasn't been peer-reviewed. And on the manuscript page, there's clear text that this is a preprint, and there's a link through to further information about what a preprint is. And all of the PDFs will have a watermark saying that this is pre-review material. So the HTML page won't look like that, that's just a bit of a mock-up. So the features, as I've said, are very similar to bioRxiv, so there'll be an author's PDF and associated metadata. All preprints posted will have a DOI, therefore they're citable, and authors can upload a revision of their manuscript at any time. There are alt metrics or alternative metrics, there's comments, and all of the preprints will link through to a final published version if it does get published. And so just to finish off, I just wanted to talk about what can happen to a preprint once it's been posted. And so this kind of touches on ethics. So again, just want to give credit to bioRxiv because they've spent a long time looking and developing kind of policies in this area. Authors can submit a revised version of a preprint at any time, but because it's been posted and it's got a DOI, it's citable, it can't just be removed, it's part of the record. And so takedowns will only happen in very, very rare circumstances. So if a journal retracts a manuscript, then medRxiv will flag this and it will link back to that retraction. Or an author may choose to want to withdraw the preprint themselves, and in that case we will mark it as withdrawn, but we won't remove the manuscript, but we'll also ask people not to cite it, but it will remain there. An interesting concept is what happens if a third party flags an issue with a preprint, because the server hasn't actually made any certification claim to the quality or the accuracy or the truth in the preprint over and above our do no harm test. So what happens in those situations, and I think we're going to have to see, it depends on the issue. I guess in the first instance we would recommend that people use the comments to try and start a discussion with the author, but obviously if this was anything to do with a potential harm, then we would take it seriously. And so takedowns, they are very rare, but they are able to happen under these circumstances, such as kind of legal reasons, ethical breaches, or anything to do with a potential harm. So medRxiv will be launched in the next couple of months, so watch out for announcements, particularly in the next coming week or so. You can follow us on Twitter at medRxiv Preprint, and just would like to finish by thanking Richard Sever for some of his slides and examples from bioRxiv, and the rest of the team for their expertise on bringing the project together. And thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions for Claire? Theo, you're welcome to join in also. Bernd, did you have a question?
Can you hear that? Okay, about the withdrawal mechanism, which is sort of not present at bioRxiv at the moment. Do the authors need to justify the withdrawal? Will it be transparent? Will it be reported why the withdrawal happened?
I think they ask for that, yeah, currently on bioRxiv, and we will ask for that information and post it if possible.
Okay, because as Katherine said, many people are just, click it by accident almost, and then they want to withdraw desperately for no particular reason. So will you allow that to happen,
Yeah.
or will you screen for?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. That's a difference to bioRxiv, actually.
Okay. Is it not? So Theo's
Theo?
disagree.
Yeah, but that example on bioRxiv isn't actually there on the live site. There is no withdrawn on that paper on bioRxiv. They are going to do that.
The intention is that we make the technology common so that we can enable these functions on these and other preprint servers. It seemed like withdrawn was actually from, I think, one of us this morning mentioned that PLOS is now doing J to B, that is from PLOS journals automatically depositing into bioRxiv. That's created a huge number of new postings in bioRxiv, and some of them turn out the author just clicked the wrong button and got surprised. So I think there's an increasing use case now. Other questions for Claire? Ellen?
Have you done any projections on how many submissions you expect in your first year?
We haven't. We've looked at the amount of biomedical content on bioRxiv. There's a number of clinical trials on there, and so that's why we felt that we wanted to have a separate site that had different screening processes. But no, we don't know. There's a lot of opposition to preprints in this area, but there's another camp that are really positive about it. So we just felt that it's going to happen, and so BMJ wanted to do it so we could help to control and try and make it as safe as possible.
I think the sort of common wisdom I've heard is that it's likely to accelerate much more slowly than bioRxiv did, and in its early days it was a pretty slow acceleration because people would just be more conservative, including the partners themselves. Matt?
My question is this an exclusive partnership, or will medRxiv be working with others as well?
No, it's publisher neutral. It will be exactly the same way that bioRxiv acts, so there'll be B to J set up on kind of various journals. BMJ, we're lending the medical expertise and the publishing expertise to Cold Spring Harbor, who don't have that medical experience, so that's where the partnership comes.
Let's see if I can comment on that. I think that we could distinguish this approach, say bioRxiv can be distinguished from Cell's approach, where Cell has its own preprint server for papers that have been submitted to Cell. I think Lancet just announced a similar, they have the same corporate parent. I suppose it's not surprising. The intention is that those of us who work in the technical areas enable the B to J and J to B to be as widespread as you, the publishers, want it to be. I think B to J and J. Eric, maybe you know this. B to J and J to B work with all the submission systems now, I think, except Scholar One. I'm not certain. I think Scholar One does not yet support it. So EJP, Bench Press, and Editorial Manager are all working with transfers. Anthony?
I'm chastened because I hadn't quite realized the function of preprints, but I'm going to have to go back to all my interviews to see whether it's me misunderstanding or the people I've been talking to. I thought they were more for comment, you see. Or anyhow, the point is, in chemistry, which is a huge area which you don't actually deal with a great deal, there is a move now, a big move from the American Chemical Society. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing is that about 20 of the American Chemical Society's own journals are refusing to have anything to do with it. But it'll take off, I think, judging by the people I've spoken to.
What Anthony's commenting on is the American Chemical Society has done something similar for chemistry. That is, they and the Max Planck Society and one other, I don't think, it might be the RSC, have sponsored a preprint server in chemistry. It looks fairly different from bioRxiv. It feels more like a data-based set of papers. This is just working out how this works. Its own takeoff is relatively slow, just as bioRxiv's was. We'll see, I guess, whether chemists feel the need for preprints the way people in life sciences feel. Earth Sciences has launched its own preprint server, SOAR, I think it's called, and that is, unlike bioRxiv, that accepts posters, and it is overwhelmed with posters. So I think that makes it an interesting but very different place to go to look for research results. Other questions or comments for Claire?
I just wanted to clarify that BMJ won't have any preferential treatment in in anything that happens on medRxiv. We will be reaching out now. We've signed an agreement to other publishers to bring on board other publishers. We don't want to see fragmentation of preprint servers. We want to be inclusive. We've worked with Cold Spring Harbor and Yoda just for speed to get this off the ground, to design the process. But yeah, we're definitely open to other publishers. This is not an exclusive partnership.
I think one of the things that I saw at the Peer Review Congress last summer, when Harlan Krumholtz, who's one of the 6 pictures that were up there, talked about medRxiv, is there's a real interest in recognizing the concerns and discovering the mitigations, and I think that's what BMJ and Yoda are going to do in this. There's a question about whether we'll ever come up with a better term than preprints. I'll leave that to Claire. I think you're right. What we found when you talk to someone who's not familiar with the concept, they never land on the right concept. I can still remember asking folks at Clarivate a year ago about whether they were getting ready to handle preprints. And we had like an exchange of 3 emails before I realized they thought I meant publish ahead of print. And I was like, oh, we need to get our terms right. So this question is pretty relevant, but I just don't see that changing.
I don't know. I think we'd have to make something completely different, wouldn't we?
All right, thank you very much.